Yeah, I know. Okay, I'm going to keep myself to time using a timer as well as Catherine's prompts, so I will stick to 10 minutes.
I'll give you a 2-minute sign. That's what I
Okay, that's great. Okay, I'm going to be talking about pharmaceutical futures. That's been taken from a section in the paper that Simon Williams, John Gabe and myself wrote on pharmaceuticalisation. And that section specifically related to a sort of concept within the sociology of expectations, something I've been working on for a number of years, which is really looking at how different visions of the future perform particular social functions, are performative in that way. And so the argument is that different promises, visions and expectations of the future shape the present, that they do something in the here and now. So how we think about the future of pharmaceuticals in a global context actually does political work. It can be used to enrol and support, mobilise resources. It can crowd out alternative visions. So I think what's really interesting about the dominant view within UK policy and OECD policy is that the future of health policy is very much tied into notions of pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical innovation. So I think the key issue, though, and when we think about notions of what futures are, and I think what's very interesting about this conference is there is a contestation of what different futures might look like. Clearly, in the context of development and discussions of global inequality, a particular vision of what the future might look like in the context of pharmaceuticals is being conjured up in this meeting. And I think that's it's almost like a parallel universe to the debates that I'm very familiar with in the UK or in OECD policy, which is very much about the biotech, biopharmaceutical model of the future. So in the debate, in the paper, we talked about this notion of pharmaceuticalisation and the way in which particular pharmaceutical futures colonised the future, the way in which particular visions became dominant, in which they crowded out alternatives. So I'm very interested in this process, the sort of interplay between these different futures. And I'm very interested in the fact that many stakeholders, I say particularly in OECD countries, in Western countries, see the future of healthcare as being tied into drug innovation. So that's the sort of by way of introduction, really. So I've tried to summarise what I think is the dominant vision, the dominant model. I have had more time. I've given you a sort of example of this from OECD documents. They've got a forwards look 2030 in terms of the bioeconomy. There's a series of documents being published on the bioeconomy, which essentially have the same idea of where people think the future is, what the future looks like from here and now. And this is innovative biotechnology-based drugs tailored to individual patients as the way forward. This idea of personalisation, personalised medicine. That the key role of the biopharmaceutical industry, the biotech sector, both as a driver of innovation and the creation, its key role in creation of novel therapeutics and diagnostics to address unmet clinical need. Market mechanisms and the public policy that follows from this is supporting the basic science base in terms of pre-competitive research, helping SMEs, helping those who grow, providing incentives to different forms of R&D. I think we're all very familiar with this, but I think that's the sort of, as I say, the dominant vision that I think in Whitehall and in Brussels tends to be the way people think about this. Now, I've been involved in, with other colleagues, Michael Hopkins, Paul Nightingale, other people here in Sussex, over a number of years, looking at some of the sorts of problems about this, some of the issues that surround contemporary drug innovation within this type of paradigm, not in the context of international development, but in the context of the mainstream pharmaceutical industry. And the headlines here, I think it was introduced well this morning, a crisis of drug innovation and productivity. I'd go further and say very great difficulties in translating many products based on, for example, genomics into the clinic in an effective way. Pharmaceutical disinvestment, I think, from some areas. I think this is really interesting. The CNS field, for example, there's been a virtual collapse in big pharma investment from the majors in both neurodegenerative conditions and mental health conditions. And that's not just in the context of development, that's in core Western markets. So there's real problems there. So market failure isn't just about neglected disease, it's also these other areas. And then clearly high costs, and issues around access in the context of high-value, high-cost biopharmaceuticals, new biological drugs, for example. So there's clearly issues with this dominant vision, which I think are sometimes swept under the carpet or at least ignored. So I think in terms of building an alternative, one of the things I'm interested in, and was reflecting on in the conversation earlier this morning in the plenary talk, was what type of alternative future, what type of alternative vision might we put in place as a different route for thinking about the future of pharmaceutical innovation, pharmaceutical development, a way of contesting, if you like, this dominant vision. So I think it would, for me, depend on rethinking the process of drug innovation. And I think there's some really interesting work, I think it's been largely underexplored, which has hinted at the key role of the public sector, of academic research, in actually being the source of many of the successful blockbuster therapeutics over the last 30 or 40 years. The NIH did a piece of work on this about a decade ago, suggesting this. So it's not been followed up, but I think the dominant view that we have that large firms have a monopoly on creation of innovative drugs at the discovery stage is misplaced, or at least questionable. I think recognising the limits of purely market-based solutions I think is important. Clearly, I've given this example with CNS drugs of an area of market failure, and I think we have to recognise other areas, not including those for neglected diseases. For me, I think innovation, if we had a different sort of vision, might think about not just the creation of novelty, but actually focusing on the improved use of existing technologies, so the approved drug lists, for example. But there's been some really interesting work done on declining coronary heart attacks in the UK, which have fallen by some 50%, and in many other countries in Europe over the last 10 or 15 years. And that's been a combination of the improved use of drug therapy, but also changes in secondary care, changes in primary care and primary prevention. So actually the combination of existing technologies and techniques with new drugs has actually had a really big impact. So not just being focused on the use of medicine, the use of novel medicines, but actually how we can use existing technology, which we already have access to, in a much more effective way. Redefining innovation also in terms of things like the production of biosimilars, biogenerics. The challenges that were pointed out by one of the speakers this morning I think are very real, but that could be very much the focus of public sector investment and research or other forms of collaborative research. And then finally, reorienting R&D in terms of how we have novel approaches to neglected diseases or areas of unmet need. So this might be the foundation in terms of principles for this, what I might call an appropriate pharma vision of the future as compared to personalised medicine. Maybe something that in meetings like this could be sort of fleshed out. I'm being playful here and provocative, but I think we need an alternative vision of the future that can be actually used then to shape policy. I think all the outlines and elements of that were sketched out this morning, for me at least, though many of the details still remain very tricky. But this vision would be about making best use of existing pharmacopoeia to maximise public health gain, not just in developing countries, but also in OECD countries, enabling a shift to generics, developing novel low-cost therapies for unmet needs. And I put the key role of the public sector. I don't want to sound like an old sort of statist, state planner or whatever. I don't think that's the case. But I actually think what's happening, and Michael Hopkins has done some interesting work on this, showing how the public sector is increasingly in the UK being oriented towards drug discovery and early stage development at the moment. A lot of academics are involved in programs now around drug research in the present. So I think that's a really important starting point, and actually starting to think about how we can have new configurations, a new model for drug innovation that addresses this issue of market failure. So policy would look very different in that context. So can we think about how we might move to a new innovation system? And I end up with a few questions here. How might we establish a new model of global R&D funding? That was touched on this morning. I think it's interesting that those debates don't track into debates in the UK in a very simple way. I think there appears to be this sort of parallel universe between the debates in one part of the policy world and that in another. I think how can we provide effective incentives? And I'm rather sceptical about price mechanisms as being sufficient in doing this. I think the risks associated with late-stage drug failure for large companies are so huge that actually the type of incentive you need will be really very large. And the problems they have in, say, CNS drug discovery at an early stage as well mean that other types of interventions and support will be needed. We can't just rely on purely market mechanisms. Clearly, market mechanisms are very important, but not sufficient. And then finally, I think changing this division of labour, rethinking the innovation process, recognising the key role of the public sector as a source of innovation and its key importance in providing the knowledge base on which industry builds is really important. How we fund that, how we reorientate that, how we engage in new forms of collaboration and incentive, I think is the key policy issue. So, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.